What would you do if your entire career, your pension, your freedom was just one choice away from vanishing? Now, imagine that choice isn't about saving your own life, but about granting a final moment of peace to someone the world has already written off as a monster. This is the story of Officer Marcus Kane, and the day a single, impossible request from a female prisoner forced him to decide what justice truly means. And what she asked for will shock you. But before we go any deeper, I want to know, where are you watching this from right now? Drop a comment down below and just say your city or country. It's amazing to see this community connect from all over the world. And if you're new here and you love stories that challenge everything you think you know, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. You will not want to miss what happens next. Okay, back to the story. The story begins where hope goes to die, the intake processing center at Rikers Island. Picture a long, windowless corridor lit by the relentless, buzzing hum of fluorescent lights that cast a sickly green glow on everything. The air was so cold it felt like a physical weight on your skin, and it smelled of industrial bleach fighting a losing battle against the deeper, more persistent sense of stale sweat, fear, and despair. This was a place designed to strip away identity, to reduce people to numbers. And it was Officer Marcus Kane's workplace. At 48, Kane was a veteran of the NYPD transport unit. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose very posture spoke of a quiet authority. But 2 decades on the job had carved lines of weariness into his face. His eyes, which you would expect to be hard, held a different story. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much moral ambiguity and had decided the only way through was to build a fortress of rules around himself. The rulebook was his shield. His hands, resting on a duty belt worn smooth from use, were calloused and strong, hands that knew how to follow procedure without question. And today's procedure was brutally simple. Transport inmate Petrova, Anya, case number 734, B, convicted of first-degree murder in the death of her wealthy, influential husband. The tabloids had called her a black widow, a cold-blooded monster who had killed for money. Then she was brought in, and Anya Petrova was nothing like the monster from the headlines. She was 32, but the harsh lighting made her look both terrifyingly young and impossibly old. She was painfully thin, her frame so slight that the bright orange jumpsuit seemed to swallow her whole. Her hair was lank and dull, but her face was calm, and her eyes, a startling, deep shade of green, were the most unsettling part. They weren't the eyes of a vicious killer. They held no anger, no defiance. Instead, they held a terrifying, serene sadness, a bottomless well of resignation that was far more haunting than any glare of hatred could ever be. Kane did his job with a practiced, impersonal efficiency. He didn't look her in the eye as he checked the paperwork against her ID wristband. The metallic click of the handcuffs around her thin wrists was a cold, familiar sound. In that moment, she wasn't a person with a story. She was a problem to be moved from point A to point B. He guided her down the sterile corridor, the sound of their footsteps, his boots firm and heavy, hers a soft shuffle, echoing off the concrete walls. He pushed open a heavy steel door, its groan echoing in the sudden vastness of the vehicle garage. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The air was now damp and chilled, carrying the thick smell of diesel fuel from the idling prison transport van. Rain pattered softly against the high windows of the garage roof. The van itself was a hulking, dark blue vehicle, a cage on wheels. Inside the cab, his partner, a young, clean-cut officer named Miller, fidgeted in the passenger seat, his nervous energy a stark contrast to Kane's weary calm. Kane walked to the rear of the van and unlocked it, the mechanism releasing with a loud, heavy clunk. He swung the door open to reveal the interior, a grim, windowless metal box with a single long, cold metal bench bolted to the floor. The only light came from a small, reinforced mesh window looking into the cab. He guided Anya inside. She didn't resist, simply sitting on the bench and placing her cuffed hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing. Kane turned to leave, his hand gripping the cold metal door, ready to slam it shut and lock away this part of his day. But as he began to pull the door closed, her voice cut through the silence. It wasn't loud. It was little more than a whisper, but it was so clear, so unnervingly calm, that it stopped him dead. She said, "This isn't a transfer, officer." Kane froze, the door still slightly ajar. He didn't turn around, but his entire body was listening. Then she finished, her voice absolute. "It's my funeral procession." And with those 7 words, the routine transfer was over. The real story had begun. The heavy van door was still slightly ajar, rain pattering on the pavement outside. Officer Marcus Kane stood frozen, his back to the prisoner, her words hanging in the damp air between them. Funeral procession. He'd heard inmates say all kinds of things, threats, pleas, curses, but never this. Never something so resigned, so final. He made a decision. He pulled the door shut. The sound was a definitive, metallic boom that sealed them in together. He walked around to the driver's side, the rain cool on his face, a temporary relief from the tension. Sliding into the driver's seat, he avoided the wide-eyed stare of his partner, Officer Miller. "Everything good?" Miller asked, his voice tight with nerves. Kane just grunted, starting the engine and pulling the van out of the garage and into the gray, rain-slicked streets of New York. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers became the only sound for a full minute. But the silence in that van was deafening. It was a pressure cooker of unspoken words. Then, from the small mesh grill behind them, her voice came again, calm and clear. "I have cancer, Officer Kane. Stage 4. The doctors at the prison gave me 6 months. Maybe less." This got Miller's attention. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing back at the mesh window as if he could see through it. Kane's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. This was a complication. A dying prisoner was a logistical nightmare, but it also changed the context. "I'm sorry to hear that," Kane said, his voice flat, professional. It was the only safe response. "I'm not telling you for sympathy," Anya replied, her tone matter of fact. "I'm telling you so you understand my request. It's my last wish. Before I spend what's left of my life in a concrete box." Here it comes, Kane thought. A phone call to a relative. A specific last meal. A Bible. "I want to see the ocean," Anya said. The request was so simple, so profoundly human, that it sucked the air out of the cab. Miller actually let out a small, disbelieving laugh before catching himself. Kane's mind raced. The ocean. It was a 2-hour drive in the opposite direction of the maximum security prison upstate. It was a blatant, fireable violation of protocol. It was impossible. "You know I can't do that," Kane said, his voice harder now. The rulebook was flashing in his mind. Deviation from approved transport route. Grounds for immediate suspension and termination. "Can't," Anya asked softly. "Or won't?" "I'm not asking to escape. I'm just asking to look at it. For 5 minutes. To remember what the air tastes like." She paused, and her next words were a precise, devastating strike. "I thought a man who knows what it's like to be judged by his cover might understand what it's like to want one last look at the sky." The van hit a pothole, jolting them all. But the real shockwave was her statement. She had seen him. Not just the uniform, but the man inside it. And she had just issued a challenge that went far beyond a simple request. She had presented him with an impossible choice, and the stakes had just become intensely personal. "That's insane," Miller hissed, leaning toward Kane so his voice wouldn't carry through the grill. "She's playing you, Marcus. They all do. This is what they're good at." Kane didn't answer. He was too busy fighting a war in his own mind. Anya's words, judged by his cover, had unlocked a floodgate of memories. He saw himself as a young, idealistic cop, the first in his family to wear the badge, so proud of the uniform. But he quickly learned the uniform didn't always protect the man wearing it. He'd felt the suspicious glances from store owners, the subtle tension from some white colleagues who wondered if he'd really earned his place. He'd built his career on being unimpeachable, on being more by the book than anyone else, because any mistake would be magnified. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were his armor. "Think about it," Miller pressed on, his anxiety making him talk faster. "Her father-in-law, Arthur Vance, is practically royalty. If we deviate 1 inch from this route, he'll have our badges. He'll probably have us arrested. This isn't a game." Kane knew Miller was right. Arthur Vance was a man with political connections that reached into the highest offices of the city. He had publicly vowed to ensure his son's murderer never knew a moment's peace. This transfer would be under a microscope. From the back, Anya was silent. She had laid her bait and was now waiting, letting the tension build. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the highway as they left the city behind, the landscape beginning to shift from urban sprawl to the greener, quieter roads that led north to the prison. Kane's father, a Baptist preacher, had always told him, "Son, the law is there for a reason. It's the fence at the edge of the cliff. But sometimes, Marcus, you have to remember that God's mercy is the net below that catches the people the fence fails." Mercy. It was a word that had little place in Kane's daily life. Justice was clean, black and white. Mercy was messy and complicated. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but could see only the blank metal of the compartment behind him. He wasn't just seeing a prisoner. He was seeing a dying woman. He was seeing someone who, guilty or not, was facing a death sentence within a death sentence. And she had asked for one simple thing: a glimpse of the vast, free ocean before she was locked away forever. Officer Miller, sensing his hesitation, delivered the final, crushing blow of logic. "Marcus, come on. Think with your head, not your heart. She's a convicted murderer. What about her victim's last wish? What about his final moments?" The question hung in the air, a brutal reminder of the crime at the center of all this. Kane felt the weight of his duty, the expectations of the system, the fear of Vance's power. It all pressed down on him. The rulebook was clear, but for the first time in 20 years, the rulebook felt insufficient. The armor was starting to feel like a cage. The silence in the cab was thick enough to choke on. Miller's last question, "What about her victim's last wish?" echoed, a stark reminder of the brutal reality of Anya's crime. Kane gripped the wheel, the highway stretching out before him, a gray ribbon leading only to a concrete cell. He felt trapped, a pawn in a game he hadn't chosen to play. Then, from the back, Anya's voice returned, but it was different now. Softer, almost dreamlike. She wasn't arguing or pleading. She was telling a story. "I was 7 the first time I saw the ocean," she began, her voice barely a whisper through the mesh. "My family took a trip to Rockaway Beach. It was a hot day, and I could smell the salt and the sunscreen before I even saw the water." Kane didn't respond, but he didn't tell her to stop either. Miller shot him a look that screamed, "Don't engage." But Kane kept his eyes fixed on the road, listening. "The sound," Anya continued. "It was this huge, roaring thing that made everything else feel small. I was so afraid of the waves, but my father held my hand, and we walked right up to the edge. The water was so cold it stole my breath. But when the foam washed over my feet, I wasn't scared anymore. I felt tiny, but in a good way, like my problems were just grains of sand." She described the feeling of the sun on her skin, the taste of a stolen ice cream, the way her mother laughed. It was a vivid, aching portrait of a childhood innocence that stood in violent contrast to the woman in the orange jumpsuit. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was offering a glimpse of the person she once was, the person the world had forgotten. "My husband," she said, and her voice tightened almost imperceptibly. "He hated the sea. He said it was unpredictable, messy. He liked things he could control. Walls, locks, schedules. The ocean, it was too wild, too free." She let out a soft, sad sigh. "That should have been my first warning." And with that single sentence, she dropped a bombshell. It wasn't a confession, but an implication. A hint that her life before the murder was its own kind of prison. Kane felt a crack form in his resolve. This wasn't just a manipulative criminal. This was a human being with a history, with memories, with regrets. The black and white image of the Black Widow was beginning to blur into unsettling shades of gray. The rulebook had no chapter for this. The van's radio, which had been emitting little more than static and routine traffic updates, suddenly crackled to life with a different, more urgent tone. "Transport Unit Charlie 7, this is Central. Come in, over." Miller jumped, fumbling for the handset. "Central, this is Charlie 7. Go ahead. Charlie 7, we have a request for a status update. Confirm your current location and ETA to Blackwood Correctional, over." Kane's blood ran cold. This wasn't normal procedure. Status updates were scheduled. This was a checkup. Miller, flustered, stammered their position on the highway. Copy Central. We are on I-87 North, approximately 90 minutes from Blackwood. ETA 14:30 hours. Over. There was a pause on the other end, a pause that felt far too long. Then, a new, colder voice came over the speaker. It wasn't the dispatcher. It was a voice Kane recognized, Captain Roberts, from the warden's office. "Officer Kane," the voice said, bypassing Miller entirely. "Just confirming your progress. The Vance family has inquired about the transfer. They are understandably anxious for it to be completed without incident. Keep me apprised of any deviations. Do you copy? The message was crystal clear. Arthur Vance wasn't just a name anymore. He was a ghost in the machine, watching their every move. The stakes were no longer just about breaking a rule. They were about challenging a powerful man who had the means to destroy them. Copy that, Captain, Kane said, his voice a low growl. No deviations. Charlie 7 out. He clicked off the radio. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The pressure had just been cranked to a breaking point. The system wasn't just a set of rules. It was a living entity, and it was flexing its muscle. Miller looked pale. He's having us tracked, Marcus. I'm telling you. GPS, everything. If we so much as signal for an off-ramp, he'll know. Kane stared at the road ahead. The exit for the Cross Bronx Expressway, which would eventually lead east toward the coast, was coming up in 10 miles. 10 miles to decide. To his left, the highway continued north, the path of duty, safety, and career survival. To the right, an off-ramp leading to professional suicide, but also to what? A moment of mercy? Anya was silent in the back. She had heard the radio exchange. She knew the walls were closing in. The choice was now imminent, and the cost of the wrong one was terrifyingly clear. The ghost of Arthur Vance was now a third passenger in the van, and he was riding shotgun. The exit sign for the Cross Bronx Expressway appeared in the distance like a mirage. A simple green rectangle with a white arrow pointing east. To Kane, it felt like a sign pointing toward a cliff. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down the seconds. Every instinct, every fiber of his 20-year career, screamed at him to stay the course. North. To the prison. To safety. Miller was practically vibrating with tension. Marcus, don't even think about it. That's it. It's over. We're being watched. But Kane wasn't hearing Miller anymore. He was hearing his father's voice. Sometimes, true strength is knowing when to bend the line for a higher good. He was seeing the weary serenity in Anya's eyes. He was feeling the crushing weight of a system that valued procedure over people. The image of her as a 7-year-old girl, feeling the ocean foam on her feet, flashed in his mind. That girl was going to die in a cage. She was asking for one last memory. The exit was 1 mile away. Kane, I'm serious. Miller's voice rose in pitch. This is our careers. Our lives. Half a mile. Kane's knuckles were white on the wheel. He saw his pension vanishing. He saw the disciplinary hearing, the contempt in his superior's eyes. He saw Arthur Vance's smug satisfaction. The fear was paralyzing. A quarter mile. The turn signal of the car in front of them blinked right, toward the exit. And then, a single, clear thought cut through the noise. What is this job for, if not to hold on to a shred of humanity when the world has lost its mind? The exit ramp was here. In one fluid, terrifying motion, Marcus Kane flipped the turn signal. The rhythmic click-clack filled the cab, a sound as loud as a gunshot. What are you doing? Miller yelled, his face a mask of pure panic. Marcus, no. You're going to get us all arrested. But Kane was already steering the heavy van onto the off-ramp. The vehicle leaned with the turn, and for a heart-stopping second, he felt a loss of control. They were no longer on the approved path. They had crossed the line. The point of no return was in the rearview mirror. From the back compartment, there was no sound. No thank you, no triumphant gasp. Just a profound, echoing silence that was more powerful than any words. Anya Petrova knew what had just happened. She knew the immense risk her jailer had just taken for her. And in that silence, the dynamic between them shifted forever. He was no longer just her transport officer. He was her accomplice. The moment the van merged onto the Cross Bronx Expressway heading east, the atmosphere inside turned electric. The hum of the engine was the same, the patter of rain on the roof was the same, but everything had changed. Officer Miller stared at Kane, his mouth slightly agape, as if he'd just watched his partner voluntarily handcuff himself. You've lost your mind, Miller whispered, the words choked with a mixture of fear and disbelief. You have truly lost your mind. They're going to know. Vance will know. Kane didn't answer. His entire focus was on the road, his senses hyper-alert. Every set of headlights in the rearview mirror felt like a threat. Every police cruiser they passed, even ones going the opposite direction, made his heart skip a beat. He was a man who had spent his life enforcing order, and now he was the source of chaos. The weight of his decision was a physical pressure on his chest. The silence from the back compartment was unnerving. He had expected something. A sob of gratitude, a whispered thank you. But Anya said nothing. Her silence felt heavier than any outburst. It was the silence of someone who understood the colossal magnitude of what he had just done. She wasn't celebrating. She was holding her breath, just like they were. Kane calculated quickly. To get to a decent viewpoint, maybe a quiet overlook near the Brooklyn Bridge, and then loop back without raising more suspicion. They had maybe a 45-minute window. 45 minutes to commit career suicide and fulfill a dying wish. Every second was a ticking time bomb. He could feel the invisible net of GPS tracking tightening around them. The simple, human request to see the ocean now felt like a dangerous, high-stakes mission. The van was no longer a transport vehicle. It was a stolen moment hurtling through the rain, and the clock was mercilessly counting down. The tension was shattered by a shrill, insistent ringing. It wasn't the police radio. It was Miller's personal cell phone, vibrating violently in the cup holder. Miller looked at the screen, and his face went sheet white. He showed it to Kane. The caller ID read, "Unknown number." But they both knew. Only one person would be calling this number, at this exact moment. "Don't answer it," Kane ordered, his voice tight. "I have to," Miller hissed. "If I don't, he'll know for sure something's wrong." Before Kane could stop him, Miller swiped to answer and put the phone on speaker. Hello. The voice that came through was smooth, cultured, and cold as ice. It was Arthur Vance. "Officer Miller, I trust the journey is proceeding smoothly." Miller's eyes darted to Kane, pleading for guidance. "Why, yes, sir. No problems at all." "Excellent," Vance replied, the word dripping with false warmth. "I'm looking at the GPS tracker for your vehicle now. It seems you've encountered a bit of traffic on I-87. Kane's blood went cold. He was tracking them live. Vance continued, his tone shifting to a subtle, razor-sharp edge. "It's just, your current location seems to be on the Cross Bronx Expressway. That's a rather unconventional route to Blackwood Prison from Rikers. Wouldn't you agree?" The game was up. He knew. He was toying with them. A detour, sir," Miller stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "There was an accident reported ahead. We're just avoiding the delay." There was a long, terrifying pause on the other end of the line. Kane could almost feel Vance's calculating gaze through the phone. The only sound was the swish of the wipers and Miller's ragged breathing. "I see," Vance said finally, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "A detour. How fortunate. Put Officer Kane on the phone. I'd like to hear about this accident from the man in charge." The command hung in the air. To answer was to walk into a trap. To refuse was an admission of guilt. They were caught in the web, and the spider was demanding to speak to the fly. The simple act of mercy had just exploded into a direct confrontation with a predator. The phone felt like a live grenade. Arthur Vance's demand, "Put Officer Kane on the phone," echoed in the tense silence. Kane's mind raced. Answering was impossible. His voice would betray the lie. Thinking fast, he swerved the van sharply, hitting a pothole with a jarring thud. He gestured frantically at Miller, making a cutting motion across his own throat. "Sir? Mr. Vance." Miller stammered into the phone, playing along. "Sorry, you're breaking up. We're going through a dead zone. Can't hear you." He then hung up the phone, the action final and terrifying. The silence that followed was absolute. They both knew it was a temporary reprieve. Vance was now certain something was wrong. The chase was on. Shaken, Kane pulled off the highway at the next exit, finding a secluded, industrial side road surrounded by warehouses. He killed the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening. They had to get moving, but they needed a moment to think. It was then that Anya spoke, her voice calm through the mesh, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. "He'll never stop," she said. "You've seen a fraction of his power. Now you understand." Kane didn't turn around. "Understand what?" "Why I did it," she said, her voice dropping. "The official report says I killed my husband in cold blood for his money. But the truth is, I killed him to breathe." She began to speak, her words pouring out in a hushed, urgent confession. She described a life of gilded terror, the constant surveillance, the psychological control, the isolation from friends and family. She spoke of her husband's rages, his threats. "The world saw a powerful, charming man. I saw my jailer. The night he died," she whispered, He told me he would never let me leave, that I was his property. He came toward me, and I just reacted. It was self-defense. But at the trial, with his father's money and influence, my truth was twisted into a story of greed. The truth wasn't evidence. It was a liability they had to dispose of. This wasn't a plea for innocence. It was an explanation. And in that moment, sitting in the shadows of a dirty warehouse district, Marcus Kane knew with chilling certainty that he wasn't just breaking the rules for a murderer. He was breaking them for a victim. With Vance's threat hanging over them, they drove the final, nerve-wracking miles in silence. Kane navigated through back streets, his eyes constantly flicking to the mirrors, expecting flashing lights at any second. Then they saw it. The water. They emerged from the city streets onto the Brooklyn Bridge approach. To their right, through a break in the buildings, was a small, public overlook. And beyond the railing, the expanse of the East River opened up into the vast, gray, and endless Atlantic Ocean. The rain had softened to a mist, and the sky and sea merged into a single, powerful, roiling entity. Kane pulled the van into an empty spot. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the distant cry of a gull and the deep, rhythmic sigh of the waves. 5 minutes, Kane said, his voice hoarse. He got out, the cold, salt-tinged air hitting him like a shock. He opened the rear doors. Anya stepped out, her hands still cuffed. She walked slowly to the railing, her entire body leaning into the view. She closed her eyes, breathing in the salty air as if it were pure oxygen. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, but her expression was one of profound peace. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The ocean was doing all the talking. It was wild. It was free. It was everything her life had not been. Kane stood a few feet back, watching her. In that moment, he felt no fear, no regret. He saw a human being connecting with a fundamental piece of the world before it was taken from her forever. It was the most quiet, most powerful moment of his career. The spell was broken by the sudden, sharp crackle of the police radio inside the cab. All units. Bolo for a correctional transport van. License plate Charlie 7. Last seen on the Cross Bronx. Vehicle may have been hijacked. Approach with caution. The dream was over. The nightmare was back. The words hijacked and approach with caution sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Kane's system. The serene moment shattered, replaced by the cold, sharp reality of being a target. Every police car in the city would now be looking for them. Get in. Now, Kane barked, his voice cutting through the ocean's roar. Anya didn't hesitate. She turned from the railing, her moment of peace already a memory, and allowed herself to be guided back into the van. There was no resistance, only a quiet acceptance. She had gotten her wish. The consequences were now theirs to face. Kane slammed the doors shut, leaped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Officer Miller was ashen, gripping the dashboard. They think we're hijacked. They'll use force, Marcus. Kane didn't reply. His mind was a map of the city. The direct routes were suicide. He peeled out of the overlook, not heading back the way they came, but diving deeper into the tangled, narrow streets of Brooklyn. He needed to get off the main arteries to become a ghost. The van, a hulking, conspicuous vehicle, was a terrible choice for a getaway car. Every stoplight felt like an eternity. At every intersection, he expected to see a wall of flashing red and blue lights. He drove not with speed, but with a desperate, calculated precision, using his decades of knowledge to navigate a maze of back alleys and one-way streets. The radio continued to squawk, updating their last known location. They were minutes behind them. Then, turning a corner, they saw it, a roadblock ahead, police cars angled across the street. Miller gasped, but it wasn't for them. It was for a different incident, a fender bender a block away. The officers waved them impatiently through a narrow gap. As they crept past the cop cars, close enough to see the officers' bored expressions, Kane held his breath. It was a near miss that left him shaking. The net was closing, and they were running out of time and places to hide. The race back to the prison was no longer about avoiding suspicion. It was about survival. Somehow, through a combination of nerve and luck, they made it. The grim, imposing gates of Blackwood maximum security prison materialized through the mist, looking less like a destination and more like a trap. They were over an hour late. As the van rolled into the secure receiving bay, The scene that greeted them was anything but routine. A group of grim-faced correctional officers stood waiting, their postures rigid. And standing front and center, flanked by a man in an expensive overcoat, was Warden Harris. The man next to him was Arthur Vance. Vance's face was a mask of cold, triumphant fury. He didn't look like a grieving father. He looked like a CEO whose faulty product had been returned. Kane brought the van to a stop. The silence was heavier than any sound. He got out, his legs feeling weak. Before he could speak, the warden stepped forward. "Officer Kane," the warden said, his voice clipped and angry. "You are relieved of your duty. Effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon." The words landed like physical blows. Behind him, he heard the rear doors open and the CO's roughly escort Anya out. She didn't look at Vance. She kept her eyes forward, that same serene dignity intact. As Kane slowly unclipped his badge, Arthur Vance took a step closer. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, venomous whisper meant only for Kane. "You think you're a hero? You're a fool. You touched what's mine. And now you're finished." As Anya was led away, she passed within inches of Kane. In a movement so swift it was almost imperceptible, she slipped a small, tightly folded piece of paper from her cuffed hands into his. Her fingers brushed against his palm, a fleeting, secret contact. Then she was gone, swallowed by the prison's interior. Kane stood there, his badge in one hand, a mysterious piece of paper in the other, a man stripped of his identity with a single, unanswered question burning in his grasp. The drive back to the city in a department sedan, with a silent internal affairs officer at the wheel, was the longest of Kane's life. He was a ghost in the back seat, a man already erased. The news, it seemed, traveled faster than they did. By the time he reached his apartment, his phone was blowing up with calls from colleagues, some concerned, most just morbidly curious. He ignored them. The silence of his empty apartment was a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. He was suspended, pending a full investigation. His career, his pension, the life he had built, it was all hanging by a thread, and that thread was being systematically sliced by Arthur Vance's influence. The media narrative was already taking shape. He saw the headlines on his laptop. "Rogue cop takes convicted killer on sightseeing tour," and "Vance family demands justice for breach of protocol." He was being painted as an emotionally unstable officer, a traitor to his badge. The story of Anya's last wish was nowhere to be found. The truth had been the first casualty. He felt a profound isolation. The fortress of rules had collapsed, and he was left standing in the rubble, utterly exposed. He thought of Anya, now locked in a cell, probably in solitary confinement because of his actions. Had he helped her, or had he only made her final days worse? It was then that he remembered the paper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tiny, tightly folded square. His hands trembled as he opened it. There was no long message. Just 2 words, written in a delicate, precise hand: Eleanor Shaw. And below that, an address in Queens. Who was Eleanor Shaw? What did she have to do with any of this? This wasn't a thank you note. It was a clue. A secret passed from a prisoner to her jailer in a moment of crisis. As he stared at the name, a cold realization washed over him. His journey with Anya Petrova wasn't over. It had just taken a dangerous, unexpected turn. The woman he'd transported was still pulling the strings, even from behind bars. For 2 days, Marcus Kane sat in the suffocating silence of his apartment, staring at the name Eleanor Shaw. It was a lifeline thrown into the abyss of his ruined career. But was it a rescue line, or was it tied to an anchor that would drag him down further? Driven by a desperate need for answers, he drove to Queens. The address led to a modest, well-kept house with faded floral curtains. An elderly woman with wary eyes answered the door, chain still on. When Kane showed her his old badge, now a meaningless piece of metal, and mentioned Anya's name, her face crumpled with fear. "I can't talk to you," she whispered, trying to close the door. "Please, Miss Shaw," Kane said, his voice low and urgent. "Anya gave me your name. She's dying. Whatever this is, it might be her only chance for, I don't know, peace." The word peace seemed to resonate. Eleanor Shaw reluctantly let him in. Over a cup of untouched tea, she confessed in a trembling voice. She had been a legal secretary at the firm that represented Anya's husband. She was the one who had logged the evidence. "There was a medical report," she whispered, her hands shaking. From the night before it happened, Anya went to the ER. Bruised ribs, a concussion. She told the doctor she fell down the stairs. Eleanor looked up, her eyes filled with decades-old guilt. I was told to misplace that file before the trial. Mr. Vance, he made it clear my job, my pension, were on the line. Kane felt a cold fury building. This was the proof Anya never had. Proof of a pattern of abuse that would have completely changed the narrative of the trial. But that's not all, Eleanor said, her voice dropping even lower. Anya was smarter than they thought. She knew she couldn't trust anyone. She gave me something else to hold, just in case. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should give it to someone who helped her. She went to an old sewing box and retrieved a small, tarnished key. It's for a safety deposit box. She said the truth is locked inside. Kane took the key. It felt heavy in his hand. Anya hadn't just been a victim. She had been a strategist, planning for a day she knew might never come. The simple act of seeing the ocean had been the test. And he had passed. The key burned a hole in Kane's pocket. The safety deposit box was in a small, private bank in Midtown, the kind used by people who valued discretion. Using the key and a false name Anya had provided Eleanor Shaw, Kane was granted access. The box was heavier than he expected. Inside, there were no stacks of cash, no glittering jewels. Instead, he found a sealed envelope and a simple, black-bound ledger. He opened the envelope first. It contained photographs of Anya's injuries, vivid, colorful bruises taken in what looked like a hotel bathroom. They were dated. There were also printed emails between Anya and a friend, detailing her fear of her husband and his controlling father. Arthur told him to handle his property, one line read. Then, he opened the ledger. His blood ran cold. This was no simple diary. It was Arthur Vance's secret financial record. Page after page detailed illicit payments, bribes to city officials, off-the-books donations to political campaigns. And then, he saw the entries that made his heart stop. Regular, substantial payments to the presiding judge in Anya's trial, Judge Harold Miller. Another payment, labeled evidence management, was directed to the lead prosecutor. Anya's case hadn't just been poorly defended, it had been bought and sold. She was never meant to have a fair trial. Arthur Vance hadn't just sought justice for his son, he had orchestrated a revenge so complete it required corrupting the entire system. The murder case was just the tip of the iceberg. Vance was involved in corruption that reached into the highest levels of the city. This was no longer about one woman's last wish. This was a conspiracy. The stakes had just exploded from a personal and professional crisis to a life-threatening situation. He was now in possession of evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful men in New York. As he stood there, photographing every page with his phone, it buzzed. An unknown number. He answered, against his better judgment. A digitally distorted voice spoke, slow and menacing. Stop digging, Officer Kane. You have something that doesn't belong to you. Return it, or the consequences will extend far beyond your career. The line went dead. They knew. Vance knew he had the ledger. The hunter had become the hunted. The woman in the cage had handed him the key to his own destruction. Panic was a cold fist around Kane's throat. They knew about the ledger. His apartment, his phone, his car, none of it was safe. He was a lone man against a powerful, corrupt machine that had just shown it could reach him anywhere. He couldn't go to the police. The ledger proved he couldn't trust them. Judge Miller was on Vance's payroll. Who knew how many others were compromised? He thought of Miller, his partner, but dismissed it instantly. The young officer was too scared, too by the book. He'd likely turn the evidence over to his superiors, and it would vanish forever. He needed an outsider. Someone with a platform and a reputation for integrity. He remembered a name from the headlines, Sarah Jenkins, an investigative journalist for the New York Ledger. She had broken major corruption stories before, and she had a famous disdain for Arthur Vance. From a payphone, a relic he had to search for, he made the call. He was cryptic, paranoid. I have something on Arthur Vance. The Anya Petrova case was just the beginning. To his surprise, Jenkins didn't hang up. She agreed to meet in a public place, the main reading room of the New York Public Library. It was crowded, open, and had multiple exits. When he met her, he saw a sharp, calculating woman in her 40s. He handed her a manila envelope containing copies of the ledger pages and the photos. As she skimmed them, her eyes widened. "My God," she whispered. This is bigger than you know. Vance is connected to the city's top brass. If we publish this, it will be a declaration of war. It's already war, Kane replied, his voice flat. I'm just returning fire. Jenkins looked at him, not with pity, but with a grim respect. Okay, Kane, you've just lit the fuse. Now we see how big the explosion is. He had passed the point of no return. There was no retrieving the evidence now. The story was out of his hands, and the clock was ticking down to a public detonation that would shake the city to its core. The wait was agony. For 48 hours, Kane lived like a ghost, moving between cheap motels, constantly looking over his shoulder. He expected a knock on the door every second. He saw Arthur Vance's face in every stranger. The silence from Sarah Jenkins was deafening. Then it happened. He was in a diner, nursing a cold coffee, when he saw the front page of the New York Ledger on a nearby table. The headline was in bold, block letters. Vance Empire of Corruption, Bribes, Betrayal, and a Framed Woman. Beneath it was a grainy but unmistakable photo of Anya Petrova. His hands trembled as he grabbed a copy. Sarah Jenkins's article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It laid out the entire sordid tale, from the suppressed medical report to the detailed ledger entries bribing Judge Miller. It framed Anya not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a victim of a ruthless conspiracy, a woman brutalized by her husband and then systematically destroyed by his powerful father. And at the center of the story was the disgraced transport officer who had risked everything to uncover the truth. The city erupted. The story was everywhere, on the news, on social media, on everyone's lips. The narrative flipped overnight. Kane went from being a rogue cop to a reluctant whistleblower. Reporters camped outside his empty apartment. The police commissioner announced a full, independent review of Anya's case. But the biggest news came by midday. Arthur Vance was arrested by federal agents on charges of racketeering, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The system, when faced with undeniable, public evidence, had no choice but to turn on its master. Kane felt no triumph, only a hollow exhaustion. He had won. He had exposed the corruption and cleared his name. But as he read the paper, one small, buried paragraph caught his eye. It mentioned that due to the advanced stage of her illness, Anya Petrova had been moved to the prison infirmary. The victory felt fragile. They had won the war, but the soldier at the heart of it was fading away. With his name publicly cleared, Kane was able to do what was once impossible. He requested, and was granted, permission to visit Anya Petrova. The prison infirmary was a different kind of cage, softer, quieter, but a cage nonetheless. The smell was of antiseptic and mortality. Anya was propped up on a thin pillow, dwarfed by the medical bed. She was even paler, her body frail beneath the sheets, but her eyes, those deep green pools, still held their unsettling serenity. She smiled weakly when she saw him. "I saw the papers," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. "You did it." "We did it," Kane corrected, pulling a chair to her bedside. "You planned it all along, didn't you? The request to see the ocean. You were testing me." A faint, knowing glimmer shone in her eyes. "I needed to know if you were a good man who followed rules, or a good man who knew when to break them. There's a difference." She took a shallow, rattling breath. "Thank you. Not for the ocean, but for believing me. For seeing me." They sat in silence for a moment, a former jailer and his prisoner, bound together by a secret that had toppled an empire. "I'm sorry," Kane said, the words surprising him. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you had to go through all of this." Anya shook her head slowly. "Don't be. You gave me back my name. That's more valuable than freedom." She looked toward the small, barred window. "The ocean, was it stormy that day?" "Yes," Kane said. "It was powerful, like it was angry for you." A single tear escaped and traced a path down her temple. "Good," she whispered. She closed her eyes, a look of profound peace settling on her features. Her final words to him were soft, but they would echo in his mind forever. "You didn't just bend the line, Marcus. You showed them it was drawn in the wrong place." He stayed until she fell asleep, her breathing shallow but even. He had gone to the Overlook to give her peace. He realized, leaving the infirmary, that she had given him something in return, a purpose that went beyond the rulebook. Anya Petrova died in her sleep 2 days later. She never saw her official exoneration, which was rushed through the courts in the wake of the scandal, but she died knowing the truth was finally known. Her obituary, fueled by Sarah Jenkins's reporting, painted a portrait of a woman wronged by a corrupt system and redeemed by an act of unexpected humanity. For Marcus Kane, the aftermath was a quiet storm. He was reinstated to the force with full honors, hailed as a hero. But the badge felt different on his uniform now. He had seen what lay behind the curtain of power and procedure. He attended Anya's small, private funeral, standing at the back, a silent witness to the end of the story he had helped rewrite. Arthur Vance's empire crumbled. The Ledger evidence triggered a wave of federal indictments that reached deep into the city's political and judicial systems. The story wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about a systemic cleansing. Kane testified before grand juries, his testimony calm and factual, the model of an unwavering officer. But inside, the weary cynicism had been replaced by a hard-won, sober understanding. He returned to duty, but he was a changed man. He still followed the rules, but he now understood they were a framework, not a cage. He treated everyone he encountered, from petty criminals to scared victims, with a new depth of perception, looking for the human story behind the incident report. The memory of Anya's serenity in the face of death and her gratitude for a single moment of grace became a permanent part of him. The victory was bittersweet. He had won his life back, but a woman had to lose hers for the truth to be heard. Justice had been served, but it had come too late for the person who needed it most. Weeks later, on his first day off, Marcus Kane found himself driving. He didn't plan the route, but his hands seemed to know the way. He ended up at the same overlook on the Brooklyn Bridge. The sky was clear now, the ocean a vast, brilliant blue stretching out to the horizon. It was peaceful, free. He leaned against the railing, the same spot where Anya had stood. He thought about the chain of events that had led here. A simple request, a broken rule, an uncovered conspiracy, a life lost. So, I leave you with this question. Was Marcus Kane a good cop? The system would say no. He blatantly disobeyed a direct order. He endangered his partner and the public. He compromised a prison transfer. By the book, he failed. But then again, he exposed a deep-rooted corruption that the system itself was too blind or too complicit to see. He gave a dying woman her last wish and her name back. He followed a deeper, more human law when the written law had been bought and paid for. The rulebook is clear, but life, as Marcus Kane discovered, is not. So what do you think? Did he betray his badge that day, or did he ultimately fulfill its truest purpose? The answer, perhaps, depends on where you choose to draw the line.